In 1754, a young man named George Washington led 40 men into the dark forests of the Ohio River Valley. He was 22 years old. He was ambitious. He was inexperienced, and he had no idea that his next decision would change the course of world history. That spring, Washington received orders from the governor of Virginia. The French were building forts in territory claimed by Britain. Washington was to deliver a warning. Leave this land or face the consequences, the French commander received. Washington politely listened to the message. Then he smiled and said no. The Ohio Valley belonged to France. It had always belonged to France, and it would remain French. Washington returned to Virginia empty-handed, but he brought back something far more dangerous than a refusal. He brought back a report. The French were not just exploring, they were fortifying, and they were not going to leave without a fight. The governor of Virginia read this report with growing alarm. The French were building a chain of forts that would lock the British colonies to the coast. If the French controlled the Ohio River, they controlled the interior of North America, and that meant they controlled the future. Something had to be done, and that something fell to the same young man who had delivered the warning. George Washington was promoted to lieutenant colonel of the Virginia militia. His mission was clear: lead 200 men into the wilderness, find the French, and drive them out. It was a mission that would start a war that would spread across 5 continents, a war that would redraw the map of the world, and a war that would create the very nation that Washington himself would one day lead. But in May of 1754, none of that was visible. All Washington could see were the trees, the rivers, the endless green wilderness, and somewhere out there the enemy. He marched his men through dense forest, across rushing streams, over mountain ridges. The journey was grueling. The men were exhausted. Supplies ran low. And still they pressed on deeper into territory that no British force had ever claimed. On the morning of May 28th, Washington received word that a French scouting party was nearby. 40 men, sleeping, unaware, vulnerable. Washington made his decision quickly. He divided his force. He surrounded the French camp, and at dawn his men opened fire. The battle lasted only 15 minutes. 10 French soldiers were killed, 21 were captured. One escaped into the forest to tell the tale. Among the dead was the French commander Ensign Joseph Colon de Jumonville. He was young, he was unarmed, and according to some accounts, he was carrying diplomatic papers when he died. Washington had not just attacked a military patrol, he had killed a diplomatic messenger. In the rules of 18th century warfare, this was not battle. This was assassination. The French called it murder. The British called it self-defense. History would call it the beginning of the French and Indian War, but George Washington would call it something else entirely. He would call it the worst mistake of his young life. Because the French were coming, and they were coming for him, Washington retreated to a small meadow in the wilderness. His men built a crude fortification. They called it Fort Necessity. The name would prove tragically accurate. On July 3rd, 1754, 600 French soldiers and their Native American allies surrounded Fort Necessity. The battle raged through the night. Rain poured down. Muskets misfired. Men drowned in the mud. By morning, Washington was out of ammunition. His men were starving. His Indian allies had deserted him, and the French commander Jumonville's brother was demanding surrender. Washington had no choice. He signed the Articles of Capitulation. But there was a problem. The document was in French. Washington did not read French, and the translator gave him a version that admitted to the assassination of Jumonville. George Washington, the future father of his country, had just signed a confession to murder. In a language he could not understand, under terms he did not know. He was accepting. It was a humiliation that would haunt him for years. But it was also a lesson in the dangers of ignorance, a lesson in the cost of arrogance, and a lesson in the reality of war in the American wilderness. When news of Jumonville Glen reached London, the reaction was explosive. The Duke of Newcastle, Britain's prime minister, wanted immediate retaliation. But his political enemies made the military plans public, alerting France. The element of surprise was lost. What had been a frontier skirmish was now an imperial crisis. Britain and France were on the brink of war, and the spark that had lit the fuse was a single shot fired by a 22-year-old who had no idea what he was starting. The French and Indian War had begun. and nothing in North America would ever be the same. To understand why a single shot in a remote forest could start a world war, we must understand what North America looked like in 1754. And that picture was far more complicated than any map could show. The British colonies stretched from Maine to Georgia. Over 1 million people lived in these 13 colonies. They were farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and slaves. They built towns, cleared forests, and pushed ever westward. They were above all land hungry. The French presence was very different. Only 60,000 French colonists lived in North America, but they controlled something far more valuable than numbers. They controlled the rivers, the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes, the Mississippi, and most importantly, the Ohio River. For the French, these rivers were not just waterways. They were the arteries of empire. They connected Quebec to Louisiana. They allowed French fur traders to move deep into the interior, and they created a vast commercial network that reached from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic. The Ohio River Valley sat at the heart of this system. Control the Ohio, and you controlled the link between Canada and Louisiana. Lose the Ohio, and the French Empire in North America would be cut in half. For the British, the Ohio Valley represented something equally vital. It was the gateway to the West. The land beyond the Appalachians was fertile, vast, and seemingly unlimited. British colonists had been pushing into this territory for decades. Land speculators had already claimed millions of acres. Settlers were ready to move. The collision was inevitable. Two empires, one valley, and both sides convinced that history was on their side. But there was a third party in this struggle, a party that both Britain and France claimed to respect, but neither truly understood: the Native American tribes who had lived in the Ohio Valley for thousands of years. The Iroquois Confederacy was the most powerful native alliance in the Northeast. For decades, they had played Britain and France against each other. They traded with both, they allied with both, and they maintained their independence by ensuring that neither European power became too strong. But by the 1740s, this balance was breaking down. British settlers were pouring into Iroquois territory. The Iroquois could no longer control the flood, and their influence over the smaller tribes of the Ohio Valley was weakening. The Ohio Valley tribes faced an even more direct threat: the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, the Wyandot. These nations had been pushed west by British expansion. They had found refuge in the Ohio Valley, and now they watched as both European powers claimed their land. For these tribes, the choice between Britain and France was not about loyalty. It was about survival, and most chose the French. Not because they loved France, but because the French traded with them. The French married their women. The French lived among them. And most importantly, the French did not clear the land for farming. The British were different. British settlers came to stay. They cut down forests. They fenced fields. They brought cattle and plows, and the relentless logic of private property. The Ohio Valley tribes' British expansion meant the end of their world. When the French built forts in the Ohio Valley, many Native Americans saw them not as invaders, but as protectors. When the British sent young George Washington to challenge them, they saw not a diplomat, but a harbinger of destruction. This was the tinderbox that Washington's shot ignited. Not just a dispute between European powers, but a struggle for the future of a continent, a struggle that would involve dozens of native nations, a struggle that would reshape the relationship between Europeans and indigenous peoples, and a struggle that would determine whether North America would be British-French or something entirely new. In 1755, Britain decided to end the conflict quickly. They sent their best general to America. His name was Edward Braddock. He was 60 years old. He was a veteran of European wars, and he was completely unprepared for what awaited him. Braddock arrived in Virginia with 2 regiments of regular British soldiers, 2,000 men, redcoats, bright muskets, perfect discipline. They looked magnificent, and they were utterly useless. The problem was not Braddock's courage. It was his mindset. He was a European general fighting a European war. He expected to meet the French in open fields. He expected them to form lines and exchange volleys. He expected them to fight like gentlemen. The French and their native allies had other ideas. Braddock's mission was to capture Fort Duquesne, the French stronghold at the forks of the Ohio River. From there, he would push north into Canada. The war would be over in a single campaign. Or so the plan went. The march began in June. Braddock cut a road through the wilderness, 12 feet wide. Straight as an arrow. It was impressive engineering. It was also a perfect target. The road was slow going. The army moved at a crawl. Wagons broke down. Horses died. Supplies dwindled. And every day the forest grew thicker, the mountains steeper, the enemy closer. On July 9th, Braddock crossed the Monongahela River. His force numbered 1,500 men, British regulars, Colonial militia, artillery, supply wagons. It was a formidable column stretching for nearly a mile through the forest. They never reached Fort Duquesne. The French commander, Captain Daniel Leonard de Beaujeu, had only 200 regulars and 600 native allies. He could not defend the fort against Braddock's army, so he did not try to defend it. Instead, he attacked. Beaujeu led his force through the forest parallel to Braddock's road. They moved silently, they moved quickly, and they reached a narrow ravine just as the British column was passing through. The ambush was perfectly timed. The first British vanguard walked into the kill zone. Then the firing began, not from the front, not from the rear, from everywhere, from the trees, from behind rocks, from the underbrush. Muskets flashed, men fell, and the British army dissolved into chaos. Braddock tried to rally his men. He ordered them into line. He shouted commands. But in the dense forest, lines were impossible. The men could not see the enemy. They could not hear orders. They fired blindly into the trees, killing their own comrades. The Colonial militia who had fought in the wilderness before tried to take cover. They dropped behind trees and rocks. They returned fire. They fought the only way this war could be fought. Braddock saw this and was furious. He ordered the militia back into line. He called them cowards. He threatened to hang them. And while he raged, his regulars died. The battle lasted 3 hours. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. When the firing finally stopped, Braddock's army was destroyed. Over 900 men were killed, wounded, or captured. 2/3 of the British regulars were casualties. Braddock himself was shot through the lung. He was carried from the field by his aide, a young officer named George Washington. The same Washington who had started this war. The same Washington who had learned nothing from his own defeat. And now he watched his commander die the same way. Braddock died 4 days later near the ruins of Fort Necessity. His last words were a warning. Who would have thought, he whispered, "We shall better know how to deal with them another time." That he was wrong. There would be no other time. Not for him. And not for the British way of war in America. The defeat at the Monongahela was one of the worst in British military history. But it was more than a defeat. It was a revelation. The old ways of fighting were dead. The new world demanded new tactics, new thinking, and new leaders. The French and Indian War had just taught Britain a lesson in blood, and the tuition was 900 lives. Braddock's defeat was not an isolated disaster. It was the beginning of a pattern. For the next 2 years, the British would suffer defeat after defeat, and each defeat would teach the same brutal lesson. This was not Europe, and the rules were different. In 1755, while Braddock marched toward his doom, 3 other British expeditions were moving against French positions. One aimed at Fort St. Frederick on Lake Champlain, one targeted Fort Niagara on Lake Ontario, and one pushed toward Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia expedition succeeded. The others failed catastrophically. The attack on Fort St. Frederick was led by William Johnson, an Irish immigrant who had built a fortune in the Mohawk Valley. Johnson was not a professional soldier, but he understood Native Americans. That he spoke their languages, that he respected their customs, and he had married a Mohawk woman named Molly Brant.